Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to Shadow Storyteller. If you enjoy true tales wrapped in mystery, history, and a touch of the unexpected, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. Your support helps bring more bedtime stories to life. Now, settle in, breathe deeply, and let us journey together into a quiet backyard beneath the sprawling oaks of rural Kentucky, where the earth once held a secret far older and far stranger than anyone imagined. On a damp afternoon in late October of 2011, in the hushed hills just outside the town of Versailles, Kentucky, a man named Thaddeus Wren knelt in the soft loam behind his century-old farmhouse, trowel in hand, sweat beading beneath the brim of his faded straw hat. Thaddeus, known to neighbors simply as Tad, was not an archaeologist, nor a historian, nor even particularly curious about the past. He was a retired high school woodshop teacher with a love for heirloom tomatoes and silence more profound than most people ever experience. That day he had only meant to clear a patch for a new compost bin, one that wouldn't attract raccoons or upset his aging bloodhound, Boone. The soil gave way easily, rich, dark, and threaded with earthworms that twisted in the slanting autumn light. But then his trowel struck something hard. Not rock, too smooth, too curved. He brushed away another layer of dirt, then another, until the shape emerged. A pale yellowed arc nearly the size of his palm. His breath caught. Was a bone. At first he thought it might belong to a deer, or perhaps one of the old milk cows that once grazed on this land generations ago. Yet as he dug carefully around it, more fragments surfaced. Small, slender, unmistakably human. A finger bone. A fragment of jaw. Then a tiny, fragile rib, curved like a comma in the language of the long gone. Thaddeus sat back on his heels, the damp earth soaking through his jeans, his chest tight with a dread that felt older than the house behind him. He did not call the police right away. Instead, he covered the bones with a clean burlap sack from his shed, as though tucking a child back into bed. Only after nightfall, when the wind whispered through the cornfields and Boone whined softly at the back door, did he dial the local sheriff's number, his voice low and steady, though his hands would not stop trembling. By dawn, the yard was cordoned off with bright yellow tape, fluttering like cautionary banners in the crisp morning air. Sheriff Eleanor Marsh arrived herself, her boots crunching over fallen sycamore leaves, her expression unreadable beneath the brim of her patrol cap. Within hours, forensic anthropologists from the University of Kentucky arrived, their white tents rising like ghosts among the sunflowers and squash vines Thaddeus had nurtured all summer. What they uncovered over the next 3 days sent ripples through the quiet community. Not one set of remains, but 3, 2 adults and a child, all buried without coffins, without markers, without even a shroud. Their bones bore no signs of violence, yet their positioning suggested careful, almost reverent placement. Carbon dating would later place their time of death somewhere between the late 1890s and the early 1920s, years shadowed by economic hardship, racial tensions, and the unspoken tragedies that rural America buried along with its dead. The mystery deepened when a local historian recalled a faded ledger from the county archives. In it, mention was made of the Langford homestead, a black farming family that had lived on that very acreage until 1913, when they vanished without explanation. No obituaries. No death certificates. Just silence. And now bones. The name Langford stirred faint memories among the town's oldest residents. Old Man Higgins, who ran the feed store until his death in 2005, once muttered about the Langfords disappearing on account of trouble they didn't start. No one had pressed him for details. In those days, some silences were respected more than truths. As the investigation unfolded, Thaddeus found himself haunted, not by ghosts but by questions. Who had laid these bodies to rest in secret? Who had kept their story buried for over a century? And why, of all places, had they chosen this patch of earth, the very spot where he once taught his granddaughter to plant zinnias? The air in the backyard grew heavier with each passing day. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Church suppers fell quiet when Thaddeus entered. The discovery had cracked open a fault line in Versailles, one that ran beneath its polite smiles and Sunday hymns. Some whispered that the bones should be left alone, that disturbing the dead invited sorrow. Others demanded a memorial, a reckoning, a name carved in stone at last. In time, the remains were transferred to a state facility for proper identification and eventually reburial with dignity. But Thaddeus could not forget. On quiet evenings, long after Boone had curled up on the porch and the katydids had begun their night song, he would stand at the edge of the excavated patch, now filled in and seeded with clover. He imagined the Langfords, perhaps a mother with calloused hands, a father who sang while plowing, a child who chased fireflies through cornstalks taller than church steeples. He never learned their first names. The records had been lost, or perhaps deliberately erased. But he gave them names in his heart: Cora, Ellis, and little Jonah. Names he whispered only to the wind. Years later, a small bronze plaque was placed near the property line, simple and unadorned, bearing only the words, "In memory of those whose stories were buried." Visitors rarely come, but when they do, they leave wildflowers or smooth river stones, tokens of remembrance in a place that once tried to forget. And Thaddeus Wren? He still grows tomatoes. But now, every spring, he plants a row of white lilies along the eastern fence. Not for show, not for beauty, but because someone long ago deserved to be remembered. Months passed, and the chill of winter settled over Versailles like a gray wool blanket, muffling the fields and frosting the window panes of Thaddeus Wren's old farmhouse. Snow came late that year, sparse, reluctant flakes that melted before they could gather meaning. Yet even in the stillness, the backyard held a different kind of quiet now. Not empty but watchful. As if the earth itself remembered what had been uncovered and refused to let go. Thaddeus began noticing small things. A pair of boots left by the back door, his own, sometimes found turned outward as if someone had slipped them off in a hurry. The screen door, which always stuck in the humidity of summer, now rattled gently on windless nights, its hinges clicking like a tongue against teeth. Boone, ever loyal and slow to startle, would sit at the edge of the clover patch for hours, ears pricked forward, tail still as stone, staring at nothing, or perhaps at something only he could see. Neighbors, once friendly with nods and waves, now offered cautious hellos from across the road. Some crossed to the other side when Thaddeus walked into town for coffee or hardware. Not out of malice, he told himself, but discomfort. The past had a way of unsettling the present, especially when it returned without invitation. One brittle morning in early February, while sorting through a box of his late father's papers in the attic, Thaddeus found a brittle newspaper clipping tucked inside a moth-eaten ledger. The ink had faded to ghostly gray, but the headline remained legible: "Local land dispute ends in eviction. Langford family relocates south." The date, October 17, 1913. His pulse quickened. He'd seen no such article in the county archives. This copy had been deliberately removed, or hidden. Beneath the clipping, scrawled in his grandfather's hand, were 3 words: "They never left." Thaddeus sat back against the rough-hewn beams of the attic, the cold seeping through his flannel shirt. His grandfather, Silas Wren, had bought this farm in 1921, 8 years after the Langfords were said to have moved away. Had Silas known? Had he built his life on land where others had been laid to rest in secret? That evening, he drove to the Versailles Public Library, where Miss Lillian Crow, 82, sharp-eyed and keeper of every whispered rumor in Woodford County, greeted him with a look that said she'd been expecting him. Without a word, she led him to a locked cabinet in the local history room, unlocked it with a brass key worn smooth by time, and pulled out a slim, cloth-bound journal. "This belonged to Reverend Amos Pettigrew," she said, her voice low. "He served the colored Methodist congregation out near Midway until 1920, died of pneumonia, and his wife gave his papers to the library, though no one ever catalogued them properly." Thaddeus opened the journal with care. The pages crackled like dry leaves. In precise, looping script, Reverend Pettigrew described a night in November of 1913, cold, moonless, and thick with fear. He wrote of receiving a frantic message from Maria Langford, wife and mother, who pleaded for help. Her husband, Josiah, had been accused of speaking out against the local mill owners' unfair wages. Threats had been made. A fire had scorched their barn the week before. And then, silence. The Reverend went to the farm. He found the house empty, the table still set for supper. Outside, in the backyard, freshly turned earth near the old willow. No one dared ask questions. No one would. In those days, asking could cost you your life, or worse, your family's safety. Pettigrew wrote that he returned 3 nights later with 2 trusted deacons. They dug a shallow grave beneath the willow's gnarled roots and laid the Langfords to rest, not because they were dead by violence, but because they had chosen to disappear. They had fled into the night, leaving behind only the illusion of death to protect those who remained. The bones then were not theirs. Thaddeus read the passage twice, his breath shallow. Then whose remains were they? He whispered. Miss Lillian handed him another page, a later entry. In it, Reverend Pettigrew confessed a secret burden. 2 years after the Langfords vanished, a traveling midwife named Ophelia Vane arrived in Versailles, seeking refuge. She had delivered babies for black families across 3 counties, often at great personal risk. But she'd also tended to white women who couldn't explain their pregnancies, and in doing so had learned too many truths. One dusk, her wagon was found overturned near the creek. She was gone. Only her satchel remained, half buried in mud. The Reverend, fearing the worst, searched for days. He never found her body. But months later, during a spring flood, he discovered small bones caught in the roots downstream, fragile, infant-sized. He believed Ophelia had been carrying a child of her own, or perhaps had been helping a young mother in secret. Either way, both lives had been lost. And so, in grief and secrecy, he buried them together in the only place he felt safe, the abandoned Langford homestead, beneath the willow where no one would think to look. Thaddeus closed the journal slowly. The pieces clicked into place, not with the thunder of revelation, but with the soft sigh of sorrow finally given voice. He returned home that night with the journal wrapped in an old quilt. Boone met him at the gate, tail wagging once, then still. Inside, Thaddeus lit the oil lamp on the kitchen table, the one his grandmother used during blackouts, and sat for hours, the amber light casting long shadows across the floorboards. In the weeks that followed, he contacted the State Historical Society. He shared the journal, the clipping, and his own findings. They agreed. The remains should be reinterred not in a distant cemetery but right there, on the land where they'd been found, with full acknowledgement of their story. A proper ceremony was planned for the coming spring. On the first Saturday of April, under a sky soft with scattered clouds, a small gathering formed in Thaddeus's backyard. There were descendants of local black families, a representative from the Kentucky Heritage Council, Miss Lillian in her Sunday best, and even Sheriff Marsh, now retired but still wearing her badge out of habit. Thaddeus stood quietly to the side, Boone at his feet. A young woman named Imani Langford, great-great-grandniece of Josiah and Mariah, spoke. Her voice carried over the grass like clear water. She thanked Thaddeus not for unearthing bones but for listening to them. Memory is a living thing, she said. It grows where it's tended. After the ceremony, as others lingered over sweet tea and pound cake, Thaddeus walked alone to the clover patch. The bronze plaque had been mounted on a field stone, polished by rain and time. He knelt, not in prayer but in promise. From that day on he began writing. Not for publication, not for fame, but for truth. Page after page he recorded every detail, the bones, the journal, the silence, the courage. He titled it The Willow Bones, and when it was finished he donated it to the library bound in plain leather with a note, for those who listen to the earth. Years later, schoolchildren on field trips visit the farm, now preserved as a site of local remembrance. They walk the rows of tomatoes and lilies, and sometimes, if the wind is just right, they swear they hear a lullaby drifting from beneath the willow. And Boone? He lived to the ripe age of 15, passing peacefully on the porch swing one summer morning. Thaddeus buried him near the fence line, under the shade of a young oak. He left no plaque, but every spring he plants a single sunflower there, a nod to the dog who never barked at ghosts, but sat with them in quiet company. Life on the farm settled into a new rhythm, one woven with memory, respect, and the kind of peace that only comes after truth has been spoken aloud. Thaddeus still wakes before dawn, still waters his garden, still watches the stars blink awake one by one. But now, when he walks past the clover patch, he doesn't feel dread. He feels witness. And sometimes, just sometimes, he leaves a sprig of lavender on the stone. Not because he believes the dead need offerings, but because the living need to give them. As summer deepened in Versailles, the air grew thick with honeysuckle and the drone of cicadas, and Thaddeus Wren found himself visited more often, not by ghosts but by seekers. A graduate student from Louisville came with permission to photograph the willow and take soil samples, hoping to trace pollen patterns that might reveal more about the landscape a century ago. A documentary filmmaker, quiet and respectful, spent 3 days filming the backyard at different times of day, capturing how light fell across the plaque like a benediction. Even a retired schoolteacher from Cincinnati drove down one Saturday just to sit beneath the tree and read aloud a poem she'd written for Ophelia Vane and the child whose name the world never knew. Thaddeus welcomed them all with iced tea in silence, offering just enough words to point them toward truth, never enough to color it with his own regrets. He had come to understand that memory was not his alone to hold. It belonged to anyone willing to carry it forward with care. Then in mid-July a letter arrived. Not by email, not by courier, but in a cream-colored envelope sealed with wax the color of dried rose petals. The return address read simply, "The Langford Family, Atlanta, Georgia." Inside was a single sheet of handmade paper, the ink slightly smudged from humidity or tears. "Mr. Wren," it began, "you gave our ancestors back their dignity. For generations we carried the story of Josiah and Mariah leaving under cover of night, but we never knew where they went or why they could not return. Your discovery, your honesty, has given us a place to mourn what was lost and celebrate what endured. We would be honored to meet you." Beneath the words was a name, Elara Langford, great-granddaughter of Josiah's younger brother, who had stayed behind in Tennessee while the rest vanished. She signed not as a stranger but as family, distant, yes, but connected by blood and now by earth. Thaddeus held the letter for a long time, the paper warm in his hands. He wrote back the next morning, his cursive unsteady from disuse but sincere. He invited her to visit in early September, when the heat would ease and the goldenrod would bloom wild along the fence lines. She arrived on a Friday just after dusk, her rental car crunching softly on the gravel drive. She was tall, with silver-streaked braids and eyes that held the same quiet intensity Thaddeus had seen in old photographs of Mariah. Boone's successor, a gentle bloodhound named Cora, named without irony, greeted her with a slow wag and a sniff, as if recognizing an old friend returned. They sat on the porch swing, fireflies blinking in the gathering dark, and spoke for hours. Elara brought a small wooden box carved with African symbols, her grandmother's. Inside were dried petals, a lock of hair tied with thread, and a tiny leather pouch containing soil from a churchyard in Nashville where their family had eventually settled. "We kept fragments," she said, "because we had no whole story. Now, thanks to you, we have a beginning." The next morning they walked together to the willow. Elara knelt, pressed her palm to the earth, and whispered names Thaddeus had never heard: Ophelia Vane, Josiah Langford, Mariah Langford, and the child, whose name Reverend Pettigrew had never recorded, but whom Elara now called Amara, Grace in an old tongue. She left the leather pouch beneath the plaque, not as an offering but as an anchor. "So they know we came back," she explained. Before she left, Thaddeus showed her the attic ledger, the journal, and the patch of lilies now in full bloom. She took photographs not for social media but for her family's private archive. And then, standing at the edge of the property where the cornfield met the woods, she turned to him and said, "You didn't just uncover bones. You reconnected a lineage that thought it was broken." Thaddeus nodded but said nothing. Words felt too heavy for such a moment. Instead, he handed her a jar of his grandmother's blackberry jam, made from berries that grew wild near the creek, and said, "Take this. Sweetness helps the remembering." In the months that followed, letters continued to arrive, sometimes from Elara, sometimes from others who had heard the story through word of mouth or a local news feature that quietly went viral in historical circles. A woman in Ohio wrote that her great-aunt had been cared for by a midwife named Ophelia in 1910. A genealogist in Memphis claimed to have found a birth record for a stillborn daughter of a white mill owner's daughter. Concealed, of course, but dated just weeks before Ophelia disappeared. Each piece was a thread. And slowly the tapestry began to show more of its pattern. Thaddeus began hosting small gatherings each autumn, what he called remembrance evenings. No speeches, no agendas. Just people sitting in lawn chairs or on quilts, sharing stories of ancestors who vanished, who changed names, who buried truths to keep others safe. Sometimes there was music, a fiddle, a harmonica, a voice singing old spirituals under the stars. Other times there was only silence, deep and healing. The town of Versailles, once wary, began to shift. The local historical society installed a modest exhibit at the courthouse. A photograph of the Langford cabin, reconstructed from memory, a copy of Reverend Pettigrew's journal, and a map showing the unmarked graves that still dotted Kentucky's backcountry. Schoolchildren now learned that history wasn't just in textbooks, it was in backyards, in silence, in the courage to dig gently. One crisp October morning, 4 years to the day since Thaddeus's trowel had struck bone, he received a call from the state archaeologist. New ground-penetrating radar surveys, conducted at Alara's request, had revealed another anomaly, not bones but metal, buried about 3 feet down near the old well. With permission, a small team excavated. What they found was a rusted tin box, sealed with tar and wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to "My dearest Mariah," written in a hand that trembled with urgency and love. They were from Josiah, written after he'd fled, mailed to a trusted friend who never dared deliver them. Instead, the friend had buried them, hoping one day someone would understand. Thaddeus and Alara read them together on the porch, their voices trading paragraphs, their grief and joy intertwining like vines. In one letter, Josiah wrote, "If you are reading this, then the earth has spoken. Tell our child the stars still shine the same over Kentucky. And tell them we love them more than silence could hold." Alara wept. Thaddeus placed a hand on her shoulder, not as a savior, not as an owner of this story, but as a witness who had been trusted with its care. The letters were donated to the Kentucky Museum of African American Heritage, but copies remained at the farm, stored in acid-free sleeves in a cedar chest beneath Thaddeus's bed. He read them sometimes on sleepless nights, not for answers, but for the ache of humanity they carried, the kind that reminds us we are never truly alone in our longing to be remembered. Years flowed like the creek behind the house, sometimes rushing, sometimes still. Thaddeus aged slowly, his steps shorter, his hands more gnarled, but his eyes still bright with quiet wonder. He never married, never had children of his own, but in a way he became kin to many. Alara brought her grandchildren to visit. Local students adopted him as a history grandfather. Even Sheriff Marsh's great-nephew, now a history major, wrote his senior thesis on the Langford disappearance. And every spring, without fail, someone, often a stranger, leaves a single white lily on the stone beneath the willow. No note, no name. Just a flower, opening its petals to the sun as if to say, "We remember." One evening, as fireflies returned and the first stars pricked through the violet sky, Thaddeus sat in his rocking chair, Cora at his feet, the scent of rain on the wind. He closed his eyes and listened, not to ghosts but to the land itself, whispering its stories to those who know how to kneel, how to listen, and how to honor what lies beneath. Time, as it always does, kept turning. By the spring of 2022, Thaddeus Wren had reached the age of 79. His steps creaked like the floorboards of the old farmhouse, and his hands, once steady enough to carve dovetail joints in walnut, now fumbled with buttons and jar lids. Yet his mind remained sharp, especially when it came to names, dates, and the quiet hum of stories that had taken root in his backyard. The remembrance evenings had grown, not in spectacle, but in meaning. What began as a handful of neighbors sharing sweet tea under the willow had evolved into a modest annual gathering that drew people from as far as Chicago, Montgomery, and even Nova Scotia, descendants of families who, like the Langfords, had been erased from official records but never from memory. No one advertised the event. It spread by word of mouth, like folklore passed between generations over kitchen tables and campfires. One April morning, as dogwoods bloomed in pale clouds along the lane, a young man arrived on foot, dusty and breathless. He introduced himself as Micah Vane, 23, a community archivist from Birmingham, and, as he said with a voice both shy and proud, a great-great-great-nephew of Ophelia Vane. He had traced her through midwifery logs, church registries, and a single entry in a Freedmen's Bureau document that listed her as missing, presumed dead, 1913. Thaddeus welcomed him without question. Over coffee brewed strong in a chipped enamel pot, Micah shared a digital archive he'd been building: scanned letters, oral histories, birth records, even fragments of quilts that carried coded messages through stitching patterns. "Her name was almost gone," he said, eyes bright. "But I found her in the margins. In the silence between the lines." Moved, Thaddeus led him to the cedar chest. Together they read Josiah's letters. Later they walked to the willow, where Micah knelt and placed a smooth river stone engraved with a single symbol, a spiral, for continuity. "She was more than a victim," he said softly. "She was a healer, a keeper of lives. I want the world to know that." That summer Micah returned with a small team. With Thaddeus's blessing and under strict ethical guidelines, they conducted a non-invasive sonic survey of the land, not to dig but to listen. Using ground microphones and soil resonance analysis, they mapped the acoustic signature of the backyard. What they discovered was not physical but emotional, a subtle shift in sound vibration beneath the willow, as if the earth itself held its breath there. They called it acoustic memory, a poetic term perhaps, but one that felt true. Meanwhile, Ilara Langford had begun work on a collaborative art installation titled "Three Souls, One Sky." It featured 3 suspended glass figures, 2 tall, 1 small, etched with fragments of Josiah's letters, Ophelia's midwifery symbols, and Mariah's remembered lullabies. The piece debuted at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but a smaller version now stood in the Versailles Public Library, lit from within by soft amber light. Thaddeus visited it once, leaning on his cane, Cora padding faithfully beside him. A little girl no older than 6 stood before the glass figures, her nose almost touching the case. "Who are they?" she asked her mother. "People who love deeply," Thaddeus answered before the mother could speak. The girl turned, wide-eyed, and he added gently, "And people who were loved enough to be remembered." The child nodded solemnly, as if that were the most natural truth in the world. Back at the farm, changes came slowly but surely. The state granted the property a heritage stewardship designation, ensuring that no future owner could develop or disturb the land without historical review. A small grant allowed Thaddeus to restore the old smokehouse into a reading nook filled with donated books on forgotten histories, oral traditions, and rural resilience. School groups began visiting not just for history lessons, but for listening walks, guided meditations on silence, memory, and the stories held in soil. One rainy afternoon in late September, Thaddeus received a package with no return address. Inside was a hand-bound book titled "The Willow Bones," a family recollection, compiled by Ilara, Micah, and a dozen others who had visited the farm over the years. It contained photographs, transcribed letters, soil samples pressed between wax paper, and a fold-out map tracing migration paths, hidden routes, and safe houses across Kentucky. On the dedication page it read, "For Thaddeus Wren, who knelt when others would have walked away. He cried that night, not from sadness but from the quiet weight of being seen." As autumn returned, so did the chill, and with it, a fatigue Thaddeus could no longer ignore. His doctor spoke gently of slowing down, of rest, of letting others carry what he no longer could. He did not fear death, only the thought that the backyard might fall silent again. But the community would not allow it. At the next Remembrance Evening, under a sky streaked with sunset and the first stars of October, Ilara stood before the gathering and announced the formation of the Langford Vane Stewardship Collective, a group of historians, descendants, students, and neighbors committed to preserving the site, hosting annual gatherings, and continuing Thaddeus's work of quiet witness. Thaddeus, wrapped in a quilt stitched by local quilters using patterns inspired by Ophelia's satchel, listened with tears in his eyes and a hand clasped in Ilara's. "You don't have to hold it all," she whispered. "We've got it now." Winter came early that year, with snow dusting the willow branches like lace. Thaddeus spent his days by the wood stove, reading letters from new visitors, sorting seeds for next spring's garden, and watching Cora nap in sunbeams that slanted through the old windows. He wrote less now, but when he did, his words were distilled, clear, simple, true. One morning in February, he woke to find the backyard blanketed in stillness. No wind, no birds, just snow and silence and the faint scent of wood smoke. He dressed slowly, made coffee, and stepped outside in his boots and coat. At the willow he knelt, not easily but with reverence, and pressed his palm to the cold earth. "I'm still here," he whispered. And though no voice answered, he felt it, the quiet affirmations of those who had come before, and those who would come after. By spring, Thaddeus's health had declined further. He moved into a small room on the main floor, where he could see the backyard from his bed. Students from the local high school took turns tending the garden. Micah sent weekly audio messages, readings from newly discovered letters, updates on community projects. Ilara visited every other week, always bringing peach cobbler and stories of her grandchildren learning to plant lilies. On the first day of May, as apple blossoms drifted like snow across the yard, Thaddeus closed his eyes for the last time. He did not suffer. He simply slipped away as gently as a leaf falling into still water. His funeral was held beneath the willow. Not a formal service, but a gathering, exactly as he would have wanted. People brought seeds, poems, jars of homemade jam, and stories. Ilara read Josiah's last letter. Micah played a recording of a lullaby that had been passed down in his family for generations, a song Ophelia may have sung. And Cora, now gray-muzzled and slow, lay at the base of the tree as if guarding the silence one last time. Per his wishes, Thaddeus was not buried on the property. "That land belongs to them," he had written in his will. "I was only its caretaker." Instead, he was laid to rest in the town cemetery, beneath a simple stone that read, "Thaddeus Wren, Listener." But his presence remains. Every spring, the Stewardship Collective plants a new row of white lilies along the eastern fence. Every autumn, they gather beneath the willow, not to mourn, but to remember aloud. And every visitor, whether descendant, scholar, or curious soul, leaves something small: a stone, a feather, a pressed flower. The earth, once a vault of secrets, has become a sanctuary of memory. And if you listen closely on a still night, when the wind pauses and the stars hang low, you might hear not ghosts, but gratitude, rippling outward like ripples in a pond, long after the stone has settled. Years flowed like the creek behind the old Wren farmhouse, quiet, persistent, carving deeper meaning into the land with every season. By the spring of 2025, the stewardship of the backyard had become a living tradition, woven into the rhythm of Versailles itself. What began as Thaddeus Wren's solitary act of care had blossomed into a community covenant, honored not with fanfare, but with consistency, reverence, and the kind of quiet dedication that changes a place forever. Ilara Langford now split her time between Atlanta and a small cottage she'd rented just half a mile down the road. She called it the Listening House, and it served as both home and archival hub for the Langford Vane Stewardship Collective. Inside, shelves held labeled boxes of letters, soil samples, oral history transcripts, and delicate fabric swatches believed to be from Ophelia Vane's travel satchel. A wall map, marked with colored pins and handwritten notes, traced connections from Kentucky to Tennessee, Ohio, and beyond, each pin a life once lost to record, now gently restored to narrative. Micah Vane, now working with a national initiative on grounded memory, a project dedicated to honoring unmarked burial sites, returned every quarter to lead workshops on ethical documentation. He taught students how to photograph without intrusion, how to interview elders with patience, and how to read a landscape not for what it hides, but for what it offers to those who listen. His mantra, often repeated under the willow, was simple: "We are not excavators. We are witnesses." The willow itself had grown broader, its branches draping lower, as if bowing to the weight of all it had seen. Beneath it, the bronze plaque gleamed in rain and sun alike, its words worn smooth in places by countless fingertips. Visitors no longer needed directions. They found the farm by instinct, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. Some came grieving. Others came seeking. A few came simply to sit in silence and let the land hold them. One warm June evening, a school bus pulled onto the gravel drive. It carried 20 high school students from a rural district in eastern Kentucky, part of a new state pilot program called Roots and Remembrance. Their teacher, a young woman named Daphne Lowe, had grown up hearing whispers about the bones in the backyard, but had only learned the full story in graduate school. Now she brought her students not to gawk but to learn how history lives, not in marble monuments but in soil, in silence, in the courage to say a name aloud. The students spent the day planting native wildflowers along the property line. Purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and milkweed for monarchs. In the afternoon, Ilara gathered them beneath the willow and asked a single question. If your great-great-grandchild stood here 100 years from now, what would you want them to know about you? The answers came haltingly at first, then with growing clarity. One boy spoke of his Cherokee grandmother's basket weaving. A girl mentioned her abuela's tamales and the way she hummed while cooking. Another student, quiet until then, said simply, "I want them to know I tried to be kind even when it was hard." Ilara nodded. "That," she said, "is how memory survives. Not in grand speeches, but in small truths spoken with love." That night, as fireflies blinked over the clover patch, the students left handwritten notes in a wooden box by the porch, messages to the future, sealed in envelopes labeled, "Open in 2125. Ilara promised to keep them safe until then. Meanwhile, the archive continued to grow. A retired postal worker from Frankfurt mailed a yellowed postcard she'd found in her attic, addressed to Miss O. Vane, care of Langford Farm, Versailles, Kentucky, postmarked October 3, 1913. The message was smudged, but 2 words remained legible: "Come quickly." A historian from Berea College uncovered a ledger from a now-defunct pharmacy listing purchases made by Maria Langford in early 1913. Castor oil, comfrey root, and sage, herbs used for both healing and protection. Another entry, dated just weeks later, listed the same items bought by a Mrs. P., initials that matched the mill owner's wife. Speculation arose: had Maria been her secret midwife? Had that connection sealed the Langford's fate when Josiah spoke out? The truth may never be fully known. But the questions themselves became part of the story, reminders that history is not a straight line, but a tangle of choices, fears, loyalties, and silences. In late summer, a ceremony was held to mark the installation of a new interpretive panel near the farm's entrance. Carved from reclaimed chestnut, a tree once abundant in Kentucky before blight, it bore no dates, no bullet points, only a single sentence: "Some truths are buried not to be forgotten, but to be protected until the world is ready to hear them." The day was overcast, the air thick with the promise of rain. As the ribbon was cut, made of hand-dyed indigo cloth woven by a local fiber artist, a single drop fell on the plaque beneath the willow. Then another. Soon, a gentle rain began, washing the dust from leaves, filling the creek, soaking into the earth where 3 souls and 1 keeper of stories lay intertwined. Ilara stood under the porch awning, watching the rain. Beside her sat Cora, now 14, her muzzle entirely silver, her steps slow but her eyes still bright. The old bloodhound leaned against Ilara's leg with a sigh, as if to say, "We've done enough." Later that week, Cora passed peacefully in her sleep, curled on the same porch swing where Boone once dozed. She was buried beside him, beneath the young oak, and this time, Ilara placed a small bronze tag at the base of the tree: "Cora, faithful listener." The stewardship collective chose not to replace her with another dog. Some roles, Micah said, are meant to be held by one soul alone. As autumn returned, so did the annual Remembrance Evening, but this time, it carried a new layer of purpose. The collective announced the Thaddeus Wren Fellowship, a yearly grant awarded to a young person from rural Kentucky pursuing work in community memory, oral history, or land-based healing. The first recipient was a 19-year-old named Juniper Hale from Harlan County, who proposed documenting coal mining families' hidden cemeteries in the Appalachian Hollows. On the night of the ceremony, as candles flickered in mason jars and voices rose in an old spiritual, "Walk together, children," Ilara looked out over the gathered faces. There were elders who'd known Thaddeus since childhood, teenagers recording interviews on their phones, out-of-state scholars, and curious neighbors who'd once crossed the street to avoid the haunted farm. Now they stood together, linked not by blood but by shared witness. And in that moment, the backyard was no longer just a site of discovery. It was a sanctuary of belonging. Winter came softly that year. Snow fell in hushed layers, blanketing the lilies, the wildflowers, the clover patch, and the willow's roots. No one visited much during those months, but the land did not feel empty. It felt held. Inside the listening house, Ilara sorted through a new box of donated materials. A diary from a schoolteacher in 1922 who wrote of the Langford place, now quiet but never still. She paused on one entry. "I walked past it today. The wind moved the branches like hands in prayer. I bowed my head without knowing why." Ilara closed the diary and looked out the window at the snow-draped willow. She thought of Thaddeus kneeling in the dirt, trowel in hand, unknowingly opening a door that would never fully close. He hadn't sought fame. He hadn't wanted answers. He'd only wanted to do right by what the earth had revealed. And in doing so, he had helped stitch a torn piece of history back into the fabric of the present. Now, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the wind whispered through the eaves, Ilara picked up a pen and began writing, not for an archive but for herself. "Today," she wrote, "I remembered that memory is not a burden. It is a gift we pass hand to hand like a lantern in the dark." Outside, the first stars appeared, distant, constant, watching over all that had been lost, found, and loved. And somewhere beneath the snow, the roots of the willow reached deeper, holding the stories close, waiting for the next listener to kneel and say softly, "I'm here." Spring returned to Versailles with a gentleness that felt like forgiveness. By March of 2026, the snow had long since melted, and the creek behind the old Wren property ran clear and quick, swollen with rain and the thaw of winter's long hush. Wild violets pushed through the damp earth near the willow, and the first daffodils nodded in the breeze like sentinels keeping watch over what had been restored. The Langford Vane Stewardship Collective had grown into something more than an initiative. It had become a living organism, breathing through the work of those who tended it. Volunteers now came not only from Kentucky but from across the country, drawn by the story's quiet magnetism. They arrived with trowels, not to dig for bones, but to plant native grasses that stabilized the soil and honored the land's ecological memory. Others came with recorders, notebooks, or simply open ears, ready to document, to learn, to bear witness. One overcast Tuesday in early April, a woman named Calla Finch arrived unannounced at the gate. She was in her late 50s, with eyes the color of river clay and hands roughened by decades of farm work. She carried a canvas satchel and a letter addressed to the keepers of the willow. Inside was a faded photograph, sepia-toned, creased at the corners, showing a woman in a high-collared dress standing beside a man in a worn suit, both holding the hand of a small child. On the back, in faded ink, Josiah, Mariah, and little Amara, before the leaving. Autumn, 1912. Calla explained that she was the great-granddaughter of a sharecropper who'd worked land adjacent to the Langfords. Her family had kept the photo hidden for generations, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside a Bible that had survived flood, fire, and forced migration. "My grandmother said, 'Don't show this to no one. Not till the time is right.'" Her voice trembled. I think the time is now." Ilara received her with quiet reverence. They sat on the porch of the listening house as rain began to fall, soft and steady. Calla unfolded more than just a photograph. She brought oral fragments passed down in hushed tones. How Josiah had organized a secret meeting of black farmers to demand fair pricing for their tobacco. How Mariah had treated white children with the same herbs she used for her own. How, on the night they disappeared, neighbors left food on their porch just in case they came back. Most striking was Calla's memory of a lullaby, sung to her as a child by her grandmother, who learned it from a woman named Miss Mary, believed to be Mariah's cousin. The melody was simple, the words fragmentary, but when Calla hummed it beneath the dripping eaves, something shifted in the air. It was the same tune Micah had played at Thaddeus's memorial. Later that week, a small group gathered beneath the willow. Calla stood before them, eyes closed, and sang the lullaby slowly, clearly. Hush now, child, the stars are bright. Earth will hold you through the night. Roots run deep where shadows fall. You are loved and known and all. Tears fell freely. Not from sorrow but from recognition. The song, once nearly lost, now lived again in the open air. The photograph was carefully preserved and added to the archive, displayed beside a new plaque at the base of the willow that now bore 3 names: Josiah Langford, Mariah Langford, Amara Langford. Beneath them, in smaller letters, and all those whose names were never recorded, but whose presence remains. That summer, the Stewardship Collective launched the Listening Project, a mobile initiative that traveled to rural towns across Kentucky, setting up temporary listening stations in libraries, churches, and community centers. Equipped with audio recorders and trained facilitators, they invited residents to share family stories of disappearance, resilience, quiet resistance, and buried grief. Many spoke of ancestors who vanished from census records after speaking out. Others recalled unmarked graves and family plots, or songs sung only at night. Every story was transcribed, archived, and with permission, added to a growing digital map of hidden histories across the state. One afternoon in late July, a teenager named Raylan Moss, 16, quiet and the great-great-grandson of a man who'd once worked the same mill that employed Josiah, walked into the listening station in Georgetown. He carried a rusted pocket watch he'd found in his grandfather's attic. Engraved inside the case were the initials JL and the date, October 5, 1913. He didn't know the full story, only that his grandfather had always kept the watch wrapped in black cloth and never wounded. Said it stopped the day a good man walked away and never came back, Raylan told the recorder. I think it's time it started ticking again. The watch was brought to Versailles, where it was cleaned by a horologist who volunteered with the collective. On the first day of August, during a sunrise gathering, it was placed in a glass case beside the cedar chest that once held Thaddeus's papers. And for the first time in over a century, someone wound it gently. The soft, rhythmic ticking filled the morning air, a heartbeat returned. As the seasons turned, the farm became more than a memorial. It became a classroom, a sanctuary, a crossroads. School children planted memory gardens with flowers chosen by descendants. Lilies for grace, sage for healing, sunflowers for resilience. Artists came to sketch the willow at different hours, capturing how light transformed its presence from sorrow to strength. Poets left verses tucked into the bark's crevices, and musicians composed melodies inspired by the lullaby Calla had sung. Yet for all the activity, the heart of the place remained its silence, the kind that isn't empty but full of respect, full of remembrance, full of the understanding that some truths don't need to be shouted to be sacred. Ilara began writing a book, not a history but a meditation, titled The Space Between Bones. In it, she explored how absence speaks, how soil remembers, and how ordinary people become keepers of extraordinary legacies. She dedicated it to Thaddeus, who taught us that the first act of justice is to kneel. One evening in October, as golden leaves spiraled down around the willow, Ilara stood alone in the backyard. The air smelled of wood smoke and ripe persimmons. She placed her hand on the plaque and whispered, "We're still listening." And though no voice answered, the wind stirred the branches just so, like a nod. Years would pass. The stewardship would evolve. New names would join the collective. New stories would surface from attics, riverbanks, and whispered family secrets. But the willow would remain. The lilies would return each spring. And visitors, whether descendants, scholars, or strangers seeking peace, would continue to leave small tokens: a smooth stone, a pressed leaf, a single white feather. Because memory, once awakened, refuses to sleep again. And in the quiet of that Kentucky backyard, beneath a sky that had watched over joy, terror, silence, and song, the earth no longer held secrets. It held community. It held continuity. It held the quiet, enduring truth that to remember is to love across time. The years unfolded like the slow turning of pages in an old family Bible, worn at the edges, rich with marginalia, and filled with stories that grew deeper with each reading. By the spring of 2028, the Langford Vane site had become a quiet beacon, not through promotion or spectacle, but through the steady, faithful work of those who believe that memory is a form of kinship. Visitors no longer came seeking mystery but meaning. They came to learn how to hold history gently, how to honor absence without exploiting it, and how to listen to the land as one listens to an elder, patiently, reverently, without interrupting. Elara Langford, now 72, had begun the quiet work of succession. She knew she could not steward the site forever, and so she mentored a new generation, students, artists, archivists, and local youth, who saw not a graveyard but a living classroom. Among them was Juniper Hale, the first recipient of the Thaddeus Wren Fellowship, who now returned every season with a new cohort of Appalachian youth. Juniper had expanded her original project into Echo Hollow, a network of community-led memory gardens across eastern Kentucky, each planted over forgotten family plots and marked not with names, but with native plants and hand-carved stones bearing only a single word: here. One warm May morning, Juniper arrived with 12 teenagers from Perry County. They came not with questions but with offerings: bundles of sweetgrass, jars of creek water, and hand-stitched cloth dolls representing ancestors whose names had been lost to time. Under Elara's guidance, they spent the day weaving the sweetgrass into long braids and hanging them from the willow's lower branches, an old Gullah tradition for honoring the departed. As they worked, one girl, shy and soft-spoken, asked Elara, "Do you think they know we're here?" Elara paused, her fingers stilling on the grass. "I think," she said slowly, "they've been waiting for us." That evening, as fireflies emerged and the scent of honeysuckle thickened the air, the group gathered for a listening circle. No one was asked to speak unless moved to. For a long while, there was only silence, the rustle of leaves, and the distant call of a whippoorwill. Then one by one voices rose, not loud but clear, sharing fragments of family stories, dreams, fears, and hopes. A boy spoke of his great-uncle who vanished after testifying against a coal company. A girl shared how her abuela buried a lock of her baby's hair beneath a pecan tree when the child passed too soon. Another whispered that she came because she didn't know her own father's name, but hoped that standing in a place of remembrance might help her feel less alone. Elara listened with her whole body as Thaddeus once had. When the circle ended, she simply said, "You belong here too." Later that week, while sorting through a donated box of materials from a closing historical society in Danville, Juniper found a slim, water-stained diary wrapped in oilskin. Its pages were brittle, the ink blurred in places, but the name on the front was unmistakable: Mariah Langford. The collective held its breath. After careful preservation by a conservator from the University of Kentucky, the diary was opened, not for public display, but for private reading by Elara and Juniper, together, beneath the willow at dawn. The entries spanned from early 1912 to late 1913. They spoke of planting beans, mending clothes, singing hymns while churning butter. But they also carried deeper currents: fear of the mill owner's enforcers, gratitude for Reverend Pettigrew's quiet support, and fierce love for Josiah, whom she called "my steady star." The final entry, dated October 28, 1913, read, "They say silence is safety, so I will be silent. But God hears my heart. We go tonight. Amara sleeps in my arms. Josiah says we'll find freedom in the north, but I carry Kentucky in my bones. If this diary is found, know we did not run from shame. We ran for love. And if you read these words, please, plant lilies where we once stood. Let beauty grow where fear once lived." Tears fell onto the pages, but Elara carefully blotted them away. "She knew," Juniper whispered. "She knew someone would find this." The diary was never digitized or put online. It remained in the cedar chest at the listening house, available only to those who came with clean hands and quiet intent. Its existence was mentioned in a single line on the site's official pamphlet: "A private testament, honored in stillness." As summer deepened, the Stewardship Collective faced a new challenge, not from neglect, but from attention. A documentary series on America's hidden graves reached out, requesting full access, drone footage, and dramatic reenactments. Elara declined. "This isn't a spectacle," she told the producer gently. It's a sanctuary. You may visit as a guest, but you may not film the willow. You may not use the names for entertainment. To their credit, the team respected her wishes. Instead, they created a short segment on ethical remembrance, featuring Ilara's words and wide shots of wildflowers swaying in the breeze. No bones, no dramatization, just the land as it was. Alive, healing, held. Meanwhile, the fellowship program flourished. The second recipient, a young man named Isaiah Boone from Louisville, used his grant to create the Memory Quilt Project, traveling to rural communities and inviting elders to stitch panels representing lost family members. One panel, donated anonymously, showed a midwife under a crescent moon, her hands cradling a tiny bundle. It now hangs in the smokehouse-turned-reading nook, opposite a quilt square depicting Thaddeus kneeling in the dirt, trowel in hand. In early autumn, a letter arrived from Nova Scotia. A woman named Eleanor MacLeod wrote that her great-grandmother had been a patient of Ophelia Vane's in 1910, during a difficult childbirth. She always said Ophelia saved both her and the baby with herbs and hymns, Eleanor wrote. We named the child Vane in secret, though no one knew why. Now I understand. She enclosed a pressed forget-me-not, collected from her garden. It was placed in the archive beside Ophelia's soil pouch. Time continued its quiet work. The willow grew wider, its shade deeper. New lilies bloomed each spring, their roots entwined with older ones, creating a living tapestry of return. School groups no longer needed guides. The older students now led the younger ones, sharing what they'd learned about listening to the land, about honoring what cannot be proven but must be believed. On the 10th anniversary of Thaddeus's discovery, October 27, 2021, the collective held a decade of listening ceremony. They did not unveil a monument. Instead, they buried a time capsule beneath the oak where Boone and Cora lay. Inside were letters from visitors, seeds from the memory gardens, a recording of Cala's lullaby, and a simple note from Ilara. We are still here. Still listening. As the years passed, Ilara's steps slowed, but her vision sharpened. She began training Juniper and Isaiah as co-stewards, not because she was leaving, but because the story was too vast for one pair of hands. This place, she told them one evening as they sat on the porch, doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. And in that belonging they found purpose. One crisp November morning, as frost silvered the grass and the first geese flew south in ragged formation, Ilara walked alone to the willow. She placed her palm on the plaque and closed her eyes. The wind moved through the branches like breath. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. She smiled. The earth had spoken, and they had answered. But the land remembers more than gratitude. Years after Ilara's quiet passing, her body lay to rest in the town cemetery beside Thaddeus, her name carved beside his on a shared stone. The gatherings at the willow grew fewer. Not from neglect, but from the slow retreat of memory into myth. New stewards came and went, well-meaning but distant, treating the site as history rather than presence. The lilies still bloomed each spring, yes, but fewer hands tended them. The listening circles fell silent. The cedar chest gathered dust. Then, in the late summer of 2032, a developer from Lexington proposed a heritage-inspired housing community on adjacent farmland. The project, dubbed Willow Creek Estates, would preserve the spirit of the past with street names like Langford Lane and Ophelia Court, and a decorative bronze plaque near the entrance, quoting Thaddeus's favorite line, "Some truths are buried not to be forgotten, but to be protected." The collective protested. Letters were written. Meetings held. But the town, eager for tax revenue and modern growth, approved the plan. Fencing went up just beyond the old property line. Bulldozers rumbled in the distance, chewing through cornfields and creek beds that had whispered secrets for centuries. One night, under a moonless sky thick with clouds, the ground beneath the willow trembled, not from machinery but from something deeper. The next morning, volunteers found the bronze plaque overturned, its surface etched with faint, spiraling grooves no tool could have made. The lilies in the eastern row had wilted overnight, their petals blackened as if burned from within. And at the base of the tree, where the soil had always stayed soft, the earth was now hard as stone, cracked in a perfect circle like a mouth forced shut. Then the dreams began. Not just for one person but for many. Descendants, neighbors, even construction workers reported the same vision. A woman in a faded dress standing beneath the willow, cradling a child whose face was never seen. Behind her, a man with calloused hands held a lantern that cast no light. They did not speak. They only watched. And in every dream, the wind carried a single phrase, whispered in a voice like dry leaves scraping stone. You stopped listening. The first bulldozer broke down inexplicably, its engine seized, its gears fused, though mechanics found no cause. The second caught fire at dawn, flames leaping from cold metal with no ignition source. The third simply vanished overnight, found days later abandoned in a ravine miles away, its cab filled with wild violets blooming out of season. No one could explain it. But no one laughed either. The project was quietly abandoned. The fences came down. The land lay fallow once more. Yet visitors who come now say the backyard feels different. The air is heavier. The willows shadow longer even at noon. If you stand too long near the clover patch, your skin prickles. Not from cold, but from the sense of being watched by something that knows your name. Some swear they've heard a lullaby on windless nights, but when they follow the sound, they find only the willows swaying, though no breeze stirs the grass around it. And on certain October nights, always the 27th, the faint ticking of a pocket watch can be heard beneath the roots. But when you kneel to listen, the sound stops, and the earth feels warm, as if something is breathing. Thank you for listening to this tale from Shadow Storyteller. If this story chilled you, stayed with you, or made you glance over your shoulder, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. Some stories don't end, they wait. Sleep carefully.